So today is another episode of Things Hidden, and I have with us a guest who reached out to me. He's somebody who's been talking about mimetic theory and different applications on social media. He goes onto that hellscape Twitter that I stay away from. He goes right into that heart of that undifferentiated mob chaos, and he just starts tweeting away in the middle of the madness, trying to break through the herd mentality and create some kind of breakthrough epiphany for people. He goes by the brand Mimetic Value, and today his name is Q, not to be confused with QAnon. You're not QAnon, are you?
Maybe.
Uh-oh. Well, I'm gonna have to drop the phone and call the authorities. Then I'm gonna get the postal service on you now.
Okay.
If you're QAnon.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining me, Q.
Yeah, good to be here, David.
So, you told me, and I've seen some of your stuff. You show me some links and stuff, and you've got a lot of great posts trying to understand the mechanisms of mimetic desire, looking at it applied to startups, applied to consulting in the space of entrepreneurship. So we can get into that. Typically on Things Hidden, we go into more politics and culture, but we'll get into some of the economics that you've been working on. Yeah. So I think that'll be good.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we see some insights? I'm just going to give you a big question. How do we learn some economic insights using mimetic theory as a toolkit to guide our perspective about, economic choices, calculation, and so forth?
Yeah, that's a big question. So for mimetic value, for mimetic theory, what I like the most about is that Girard starts from the origin of human nature, right? So a lot of economics is essentially the study of how human nature deals with value. And what Girard says is, of course, everyone mimics each other's desires, and economics, the foundation of it is like how much do you value your desires? You're trying to quantify your desires. And so there's a lot of different directions we can go in here, and just trying to figure out what's the best direction.
What do you think is the foundation of the boom bust cycle from your perspective? And you don't have to keep it within a mimetic framework, but that is kind of the theme of what we do on Things Hidden. But where do you think the boom bust cycle comes from, for example? Is that the madness of crowds, and then the collapse of the madness of crowds, or is there what do you see there?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of that. So actually, I guess that's a good time to bring up one of the books I've been reading called The Missing Risk Premium.
Okay.
So that's by Eric Falkenstein, and his big idea is basically the idea of the risk premium is kind of a lie. So risk premium basically means the riskier something is, the more it's supposed to be worth.
Right. Okay.
So that's what people talk about. And his main argument, which I summed up, is basically most people, when they deal with economics, they kind of calculate utility in a very linear way. So they assume that utility scales linearly with risk. And obviously that's not true, because the richer you are, the more money you're dealing with, the utility is not going to be the same, and the risk is not going to be scaling linearly with that.
Okay.
Right. So basically, sensitivity to wealth is relative, not absolute, and therefore there's some sort of like status involved, and people care more about the relative status of the market, of themselves relative to whoever they're competing with in the market, rather than just like the absolute value of the good in itself.
Can you give some examples of that? Just come up with some examples that come to mind to help people see that.
Yeah, perfect example is what's been happening recently, like people doing is basically buying GME and buying Dogecoin and the NFTs. It's more like a type of like status signaling, virtue signaling type of thing, or rather like for GME, it's more like the regular people, they're trying to compete and outstatus the hedge funds, but like there's no underlying value in the in the stock or coin or whatever exchange itself. It's more of trying to kind of ride this wave of envy in the market.
That's interesting. Okay. So where does that go? How does that help us understand, where we can start to understand economics with these insights fully intact, using them?
Yeah, so basically what Falkenstein says is like people mimic others to outperform others in status. So that basically leads to his conclusion that investing is based on envy, not greed. And if you see that, that's mostly true in the startup world, as well as when you talk to people about stocks. When people talk to each other about like what stock are you trading, and they get really jealous of their friends who made like 500% on Tesla or something when they got in early, so they would feel a fear of missing out, and they get into the same stock too.
So was Westinghouse driven by envy when he invested in Nikola Tesla, to help them develop alternating current?
I don't know about that. I'm talking about the Tesla stock.
Oh yeah, I was talking about the actual inventor, Nikola Tesla, creating the alternating current. That's become kind of a mythic tale of Edison versus Tesla, and I can see there's probably some envy of trying to see who's going to compete for dominance in that field of, technological.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I guess it's like more clearly to see in modern venture capital when like some big name venture capitalist invests in some product, everyone else copies his desire and says, okay, this company must be good, so we must all invest in this new startup because they hyped it up.
So is the argument that all investment choices are kind of mixed with envy, or just most of them are, but some original innovation investment decisions are just outside of that matrix? What do you think?
I guess that's always a tricky thing to talk about when you try to differentiate most from all.
Right.
So I don't know if there's much of a difference we need to nitpick between saying it's most or all, but it's definitely a significant portion of investment choices.
Okay.
I don't have a solid proof if it's absolutely all or not.
Right. Yeah. So how do we use, if envy is behind, and I can see that, that we want to be what we perceive other people having, they have a certain social status. It looks like they're in a place that's more comfortable, that's safer, that's more esteemed, and we want to invest in the things that they seem to be investing in so that we can share in that status that we covet that they have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that does seem to be at the heart of, so much of investment. So is that a good thing, or how do we turn that into a positive thing rather than, being stuck keeping up with the Joneses rather than, doing something that's really fruitful for your time?
So when you asked that question, you kind of made me think of something else that might be a bit of tangent. So, okay, but I'll go on the tangent first, and maybe we can bring back to this topic later. So anyway, one of my favorite podcast episodes of all time is called How to Serve Man, and it's on the Martyr Made podcast. So Martyr Made is one of my friends who does a history podcast, and he talks about the crazy things about human sacrifice and wars and like conflicts between different groups of people in history. And this is one series he did, which is really focused on how do we go from cannibalism to human sacrifice to the modern world. And he cites a lot of stuff from, he's a very interdisciplinary thinker, and he's read a lot of Girard too. So anyway, one of his biggest ideas that I got from his podcast is that basically how we use money today in society is essentially a sublimation of ritual sacrifice. So basically he goes from how originally pretty much all humans were cannibals and just like ate each other, and then that became part of a cannibalistic ritual. And then afterwards, people would start to say they want to eat people figuratively, but actually they just kill them in like a ritual sacrifice. And then from there, they supplemented to animal sacrifice. And then from animal sacrifice, they went into sacrifice of just like objects that are precious to them.
Okay.
So you see these different tribes and stuff, they might burn their most valuable blanket or just like bury some coins or stuff like that. Or even modern practices like breaking a bottle at a wedding, or like throwing some rice or whatever. And he basically says that sublimates eventually into a lot of these charity events we see today, where people symbolically sacrifice their money for some sort of charity cause.
Okay, interesting. So what does he say is the driving force of that sublimation process? Does he talk about that at all, or he just describes what's happening?
I don't think I recall.
Yeah,
but that's a good question. What do you think?
I guess Girard would say that we were losing our appetite for ritual human sacrifice, right? There's this, what is the driver of that? He would say the Judeo-Christian prophetic critique of human sacrifice was kind of making us lose our appetite to keep it going and start moving it in the direction of animal sacrifice and ultimately self-sacrifice with the Christian ethic. But that doesn't necessarily account for cultures outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition that were also kind of losing their appetite for cannibalism and then human sacrifice. Do you have any idea about that? That's something a lot of Girard fans talk about, right? Like what were the other factors? You look at the Jains, right? The Jains had an aversion from sacrifice, right? And they didn't want to step on an ant and so forth. What do you think? Is that some kind of a parallel revelatory process that humans were undergoing in different cultures or at different paces, or what? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. So basically, recently I've actually been reading about Islam, and one of the interesting things they say is like God has sent prophets to every culture throughout history, and the purpose of Muhammad was actually not to create a new religion, but to like correct some errors in the past.
Okay.
And I thought that was an interesting idea. So I guess I don't want to get into whether I think is Islam absolutely true, but I think that's a powerful idea of like just like all these different prophets sent to different cultures throughout history, and even some non-prophets like scientists too. You can just like, because we live in reality, and if God created all reality, then there's certain facts we can derive from it. And even Thomas Aquinas talks about how like Aristotle came up with certain important truth just from like observing reality in nature.
Right. That reminds me of this passage that Paul talks about on Mars Hill, where he says, let's see here. I think it's Acts 17:30. It says, "In the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent," right? So God winks at our ignorance in the times prior to Christ, which allows us to kind of work through moving away from the more barbaric, brutal forms of exchange, right? Cannibalism being the worst. I mean, I don't know if it's the worst, but it's the most brutal form of what we're talking about here. And then it goes into ritual human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and then I think don't the Masons, don't they put in like in the cornerstone ritual wine and bread or something or something like that? Have you heard of that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So eventually it goes into substances that are not even animals, wheat and barley, stuff like that.
Yep.
But the more that it seems like the more inanimate the sacrifice is, the more symbolic it is, the less vicious and vital and satisfactory it is. It doesn't have as much power, right?
Yeah. So that's something I'm trying to figure out. Like, at some point people don't even realize it's a sacrifice anymore, because the utility function has decreased so much to them, it doesn't mean anything to them anymore. So what they're sacrificing, can you even consider a real sacrifice? I feel like it feels different.
That's why some would say the Christian Lord's Supper is so important, right? Because it's calling us back to the primordial supper of eat my body, drink my blood.
Mm-hmm.
And the passage Jesus uses there, you know, when he talks about it, he's talking about the word gnaw on the bone, like cannibalism, you know, it's a word like gnawing on something.
Yeah.
Which reminds us to keep our ignorance and our arrogance in check, right? If you do that on a weekly basis of a kind of symbolic recreation of a ritual cannibalistic meal, that kind of keeps you in epistemological humility, doesn't it? if you're being cognizant of what you're doing, right?
Yeah. But how many people actually think about it in that way, rather than just kind of going through the motions?
Right. But then the question is, does it still have some kind of effect subconsciously, even if you don't get it in your head, right? Cognitively, right?
Mm-hmm.
You become what you eat.
Yeah.
You are what you eat, right?
Yeah. So maybe that's why veganism is a bad idea.
Yeah, you don't want to be a vegetable.
Well, you also lose the symbolic sacrifice if you're just like, if you're not sacrificing anything when you're eating, you're not really taking in this meaning and understanding. Right? So like one of the things Martin May talked about is like, we think of cannibalism as something savage, right? Like in current day, and it kind of is, but that's not how they interpret it back then. And what they actually saw is a lot of times they would eat the flesh of their relatives who recently passed away to kind of as a way to remember them and feel like their spirit is still wisdom. And definitely like when you eat meat, especially like something you hunted for yourself or butchered yourself, for example, you definitely have a closer connection to that, and then just like getting some random Beyond Meat burger.
Is that why Cain killed Abel, because he wasn't satisfied with offering up broccoli and sprouts?
Huh. That's an interesting way to put it, possibly.
Yeah. So it did not satisfy his mimetic desire, right? I mean, he was still in a state of rage. That's why the god did not find it pleasing, and therefore he was jealous of his brother for providing roast lamb, which is a much more satisfying sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Which is why we're in the madness of the times that we're in today, right? Because we keep offering soy burgers as our sacrifice, and it's not satisfying anybody. It's not creating catharsis. It's not creating unity, and therefore we just keep schismatically breaking away from one another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, today's sacrifice creates schism, not unity. You know.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And that, you know, that whole saying, united we stand, divided we fall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because Jesus broke the unanimity of the sacrificial story, whenever that same machine is tried again today, it does create a temporary slight catharsis, but it quickly ends and then creates schism, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so that actually reminds me of like some passages in Theater of Envy.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so like
this is Rene Girard's book on Shakespeare for those who are unfamiliar with it.
Yeah, so you know how like some of the recent Girardian books I've gotten from like Colloquium on Violence and Religion, they're not actually very good. There's like some people who just argue like a completely SJW point, and they completely miss out what Girard actually said himself. So here's like a couple very decisively anti-SJW, anti like contemporary culture quotes from the Theater of Envy. Let's see. Yeah, so he says that the tradition of external obstacles and non-mimetic tyrants is the comical tradition par excellence. Today, it is more powerful than ever. It is the ideology of psychoanalysis, of our counterculture, of all sorts of liberation of the entire youth cult. It takes itself more seriously than ever. We must all pretend to believe that youth is somehow persecuted. Each generation proclaims this message as something brand new that has never been formulated before. Ever since the Greeks, the theater has been an important vehicle of this ideology, but Shakespeare is an outstanding exception.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, she talks about Shakespeare mocking romantic desire with Romeo and Juliet, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And most people still don't get that to this day, right? They read it the wrong way.
Yeah. Here's another one. A Midnight Summer's Dream represents the first example of a uniquely Shakespearean type of comedy that makes fun of desire itself, denouncing its perpetual lie about being the victim of some sort of repression, repressive gods, repressive parents, repressive student dean, whatever.
Yeah. So any kind of boundary is seen as repression in our modern culture, right? Because of our sensitivity to the hierarchies that have been mediated by sacrifice in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. He also goes into another couple good quotes. I'm gonna try to find them. But like one of the points he brought up is like, oh yeah, here's another good quote. Psychiatric labels create an impression of permanent difference where none exists.
Huh. Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you think? What is he getting at there?
Well, so I guess if you look at these like labels people like to label themselves with nowadays, you identify as whatever race, whatever sexuality, especially all these new gender pronouns and stuff, these are all very specific labels that people want to create, where they want to create a sense of permanent difference, where I am different from you, when that's not necessarily the true mechanism of what's underlying it. They're not actually different. They're just mimicking other people's desires or responding to some sort of taboo.
Right. Like the people that want to be dogs, they said, what do they call the dog kind?
I don't know, but yeah, there's all sorts of crazy people.
They
now
role play as a dog, that they're always a dog and they have to be on a leash.
Mm-hmm.
And in the moment, they feel like they're uniquely individual, that they're really finding their true self.
Mm-hmm.
My truth, they call it. My truth is to be a dog on a chain. But they don't realize that that's a truth that somebody put in their head because they caught it like a bug. They caught it like a contagion, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Somebody else modeled it for them. I wonder who the first guy was that decided to act like a dog. Somebody had to look at a dog and say, I think I'll be a dog.
I mean, I
wonder what year that was in history. Probably thousands of years ago, probably, right?
Yeah. Like there's all sorts of people with, like these ancient polytheistic animal worshiping religions.
Yeah. And it's interesting to look at the sacred role of clowns.
Mm-hmm.
Clowns were very important. They would provide kind of a prophetic critique of the king, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they could say things sarcastic to the king that nobody else was allowed to do. But they did it in such a way that it was a safe way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's like the holy fool archetype.
Right. Or today's stand-up comedians, those are like the last people that are allowed to say anything, right, about society that's true.
Yep.
And today we live in a world, it's interesting where, I just saw a clip of that poor guy, Stephen Colbert,
Mm-hmm.
and he calls himself, Christian and everything, but he had a clip where he was making fun of Ron Paul because he had Daisy Dukes on in an interview, apparently. At 80, and he was saying, oh, you're 85 or 86 years old and look at you wearing your little short shorts. You at least, this is better than your son, and just mocking him and stuff. And then he said, and now Joe Biden, he went on he said, speaking of elderly people, Joe Biden continues to do so many wonderful things for us. And I thought, how sad, what a sad robot, he no humor anymore. Like he used to be, people used to think he was kind of edgy. I mean, the people who were still in the normie TV world, oh, wow, he's making fun of Bill O'Reilly. He's a true, when he was doing that character, wow, truly avant-garde. But now he's just devolved into just talking points for a party, you know?
Okay.
That's
All
a
right.
totalitarian society, right?
Yep.
Lost its humor.
All right. There's one book I have to recommend to you. It's All Things Are Possible by Lev Shestov. So I think Shestov. So Shestov, for context, he was a Russian existentialist. So I guess the existentialists, they kind of more or less divided into the Christian existentialists and the atheist ones. But he was Jewish, was like some sympathy for Christianity. And he was the first person who made a connection between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard.
Okay.
And basically, I would say he's one of the most kind of like transgressive, edgy thinkers out there in the early days of the 1900s. And the quote you remind me of is basically where he had this passage about creativity, where he talked about all these like artists and creative thinkers. They think they're all that, but then they get too fearful. They get stuck in what they're trying to do because they created identity around their works, and eventually they're no longer creative and they're just kind of copying their own artworks and doing the same thing over and over again. It just gets really stale, and they're doing that because they're fearful, because they don't want to explore the unknown anymore.
Yeah. Is that inevitable, or is there a way to break out of it? That's interesting.
I think there
you
is.
Look at those wrestlers like Hulk Hogan who are still doing their same act from 1980, you know?
Yeah.
What you gonna do, you know, 40 years later, 60 years later, you know? They have to play that character.
Right. Like, I would say technically you should be able to reinvent yourself at any point in your life, but you're definitely not incentivized to do that, because like you're trying to build something in your life, you're trying to build some sort of structure, to like some structure of value. So it's almost inevitable that the older you get, the more established you get, the less incentivized you are to go against that.
Is that because of dropping testosterone as you age, or what?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe that's part of the factors, but I think it's more of just you get complacent with your success you already had, so why fix something that's not broken?
Do you think that's because of people who get married and have kids and obligations, or do you think it applies to people who remain single their whole life as they develop creative acts?
It definitely applies to people who remain single too. Yeah.
Remember, the Apostle Paul didn't want to get married. He said, I don't recommend marriage for those who want to pursue the things of God all the way. You know what I mean? But if you have to, go ahead and do it. I wonder if that had something to do with his desire to not get stale with his mission to evangelize the world.
Probably does. Yeah. What do you think? Are you married?
Yes. But what happens when you see our society today is they want to deconstruct anything like marriage, like family, like property, anything that kind of places you somewhere, right? And kind of ties you down. Not allowed to have private property, not allowed to have any kind of preference for what a family should look like. Everything must be obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, and that's the thing, is that what I've always noticed is that differentiation itself is what they really hate.
Yeah, exactly.
A Christ-haunted society. But they shouldn't. Differentiation can be bad, but it can also be good.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way you do it. It's how you do it. It depends on the situation. But the problem, what they don't want to address, is the violence.
Mm.
Do you think that this is a transitionary stage? Are we going through a kind of slow awakening of the scapegoat mechanism psychologically, and we're at the stage of history right now where we're super freaked out about differentiation because it can be the occasion for sacrifice, but it doesn't inevitably have to be the occasion for sacrifice? And will we move into a transition eventually where we'll lose our obsession with rooting out all differentiation, and we will finally turn our attention more properly to stopping violence?
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? Violence is a problem for people, but it's always not as, it's passe. It's not as exciting. What's exciting to fight right now is differentiation, right?
Yep. Yeah, so for this type of stuff, I always like to zoom out and look at the big picture, and with that, I always feel very optimistic and like I have complete faith that humanity is gonna be all right. Because like if you think about it, if God created all of reality, it's like, and humans have only been existing for what, like tens of thousands of years, or I don't know, some people say up to 200,000 years. It's actually not that many time. That's not that much time in the grand scheme of things. And especially like advanced civilizations, how long have they been existing for? Just a couple thousand years. Like, can you imagine how society is going to be like in 10,000 years, in
Right.
100,000 years?
That's the way I think too. I think people were, 2,000 years we've had, it is finished. And that was the completion of our hominization.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I believe that when John, the Gospel of John, talks about in the beginning was the Word, right? He's referencing Genesis. And so what you're seeing is the beginning of the hominization process in Genesis and the completion of the hominization process with the Gospels of Jesus, talking about Jesus's life.
Mm-hmm.
So that completes our hominization of becoming human. And at that stage, we then have the opportunity to slowly start weaning off of the placenta of religion and sacrificial violence.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very young as a species, if you think of it that way.
Yes.
We're very young. This is young Earth creationism completely, because we're 2,000 years old. So we don't have a lot of time. This is younger than the young Earth people believe, because we haven't had a lot of time. So yeah, you're right. I have a very big optimistic view of creation because I think we're just getting started. That we're a very baby species.
Absolutely.
And in the sense of having the ability to be aware of what we were doing. That's what Paul's talking about when he talks about God winked at our ignorance in the past, because the Genesis account to the sacrifice of Christ, that was the winking of our ignorance. We were not self-aware fully yet.
Yeah.
We hadn't seen fully what we were, what our placenta, context was. Now we're aware of it slowly. It wasn't immediately the day after Jesus, but it was a slow, obviously it was somewhat immediate for some, like the centurion who was watching Jesus die as a pagan Roman soldier and says, surely this is a God's son. So he got it, but, as society as a whole, it took some time. So we're only, 2,000 years removed from the completion of our hominization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so in some sense, you're right. We should say, hey, don't be so hard on humanity. We're just now getting started here. We're like a 6-year-old or something, we barely have any self-awareness, right?
Like 6-month-old.
What's that?
We're probably 6-month-old.
Right, 6-month-old. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions of modern atheists and stuff today, because I think they see themselves as much more mature than they really are. Right, because the way I like to think about it is like God is someone who's been there, done that for everything in the universe, who's like has like infinite experience in life, infinite life experience, and we're infants, we're toddlers, we're still trying to figure this stuff out, which means at the same time it kind of rejects most modern Christians and modern atheists, because it's like you don't necessarily need to condemn other people to hell. Because you got to think of them as infants. They're still trying to learn from their mistakes. They're just like this process of like sin is not good. But it's like babies making mistakes. You need to be learning how to avoid that over like a long period of time as a process, not necessarily just like immediately condemn people, say never do this again, or else you're going to hell.
That's right.
So in that sense, like no matter anything that like messed up or wrong that anyone, progressives or even conservatives, anyone does nowadays in the current culture, it's just babies making dumb mistakes.
Yeah, you're right. That's why they're freaking out about Dr. Seuss. That's what babies would do. Right? Because they don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to have compassion for our neighbors.
Yeah.
And we're in the same ignorance too.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, we don't understand our mimetic blind spots, our scapegoats, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's why it's also not good to have too much faith in scientific facts, which is not the same as applying the scientific method. Because like all these facts, so-called facts we have found through science, like they get disproven every couple of years. So rather it's more of a pragmatic approach where you can use these scientific facts to like pragmatically apply
Yeah.
them whenever you see fit, but it's not like an eternal absolute.
Yeah. And that's why to think like Jesus means to have the best scientific perspective possible, because you have to be suspicious of the foundations of so much of what's called settled science.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that you wildly cling on to whatever wacky alternative theory you hear on the internet, but that you have to be, again, epistemologically suspicious of things that are considered to be off, hands off, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you look at, settled questions of what is an atom.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we've had on my program, we have on my science show, we have a chief science advisor who's a physicist named Dr. Wei-Ping Yu. And he challenges the foundation of the atomic model.
Oh wow.
And he's he's an insider of the physics community.
Mm-hmm.
And he
send me some of that stuff later.
Yeah. But what I'm saying in this is that he's asking questions. He's challenging things like, does an electron exist?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not allowed to do that because, they'll tell you, well, that's, we had physicist Brian Greene on our show one time,
Mm-hmm.
and Dr. Yu started asking him questions about the electron. And they were foundational questions. And he said, no. He got upset. He got triggered. Dr. Brian Greene, he's a wonderful physicist, but he got triggered. He told our audience, I want your audience to know that these questions have already been deliberated on. We've already decided these questions. This is not something you need to ask. And it reminded me of like a nun, the movie scenes of a nun, chiding the smart aleck student for saying, can you show me how the Trinity works mathematically? You know what I mean? Or something, it was like, this is not for you to ask. And that's where you can see the Truman Show reality of so much of what we consider to be science is that it's actually a social mimetic sacred that they're binding to. It is the high priests of the greats of the physics community or whatever it is that are held up in esteem. And you must maintain your place on the social pecking order by agreeing that they are foundational insights were true and then working their implications out in, field work. But you don't go back and say there's no such thing as a black hole. That's not how you do science. Thomas Kuhn talks about that, right? You don't go into the scientific field that you're in and just start dissecting foundational questions. No, you take faith, you take it on faith. These foundational questions have already been fought for by, prophets or founding fathers of the field before you, and that their mimetic esteem of getting all the awards and recognition is proof of their rightness. But it's actually just mimetic, power that's behind them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this is one of the main reasons why I like Shestov so much. So the reason why he named this book All Things Are Possible, well, the original Russian name actually translates more like the apotheosis of groundlessness. And he has another book called Athens and Jerusalem. And so basically, the main thesis of Athens and Jerusalem is that he talks about the idea of necessity. So necessity is, I think it's like an idea a lot of philosophers believe in, which is basically you have the laws of the universe and they're absolute, and even God has to follow the laws of the universe. And he basically completely rejects that model and said, no, God is outside of these laws. These laws are just kind of like patterns that humans have came up with, and God has to be outside of them because for God, all things are possible. He has to be able to contradict these so-called laws that you've kind of figured out. And if you're constrained by necessity, then that's not really a God. That's just, your view is really no different from an atheist's.
Right. Huh. That's interesting. Yeah. So what are some other let's try to go back to the economic stuff. Give people some economic insights from where we've built so far together in this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. Okay. All right. So do you recall the podcast Peter Thiel did with Eric Weinstein?
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people saw that, but I don't think they got the main message of it.
I fell
So
asleep through half of it and I never finished it. So, but
okay.
yeah.
So I would say there's one. So basically, let me bring up the mimetic aspects of it in my
Okay.
notes. I wrote notes on it when it first came out. Okay, so basically, okay, Thiel basically parroted what Girard already said about the left or whatever, blah blah blah, and then what he says is the problem with communism isn't that isn't redistribution, it's the worship of mimetic violence.
Right.
And I think one of the things he brought up is like Stalin was actually a mimetic model for many Western communists, even though a lot of them would deny him. They would say he's evil and he killed too many people, but actually they were trying to mimic him, and they actually get fueled by how many people he killed, as if it's like a metric to be proud of.
Right. Right.
And what we see is like the popularity of actionable communism in the West also died down after the death of Stalin. Like, so yeah, so people definitely saw the death caused by Stalin as a key performance indicator in measuring their progress towards a communist utopia. So that's why he claims that the problem with communism is mimetic violence rather than the redistribution itself. And if you look at or was it Orlean? Yeah, Orlean's ideas on the empire value. Basically, he talks about how the actual economic value is in the exchange of goods. It's not in the goods themselves. So that's the main point he wants to stress. The substance value of theory of value is a lie, because they all assume that value is a intrinsic parameter of whatever object you're looking at, rather than a property of the network.
Right.
So
this fits with the Austrian school, which says it's subjective value, not objective value, that matters, right? That there's no such thing as real objective value, whether it's a labor theory of value or whatever, right?
Yeah. It's not labor, and it's also not the labor, they focus on production, and then some other people, they focus on consumption, but really the true value is in the exchange. And a lot of times in economic textbooks, they teach you originally there was barter, but then barter became money eventually. But that's actually not true. Originally, money came before barter, and barter is actually the state you go into when the economy collapses and the exchange systems no longer work.
Huh. Interesting. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand that a little bit in some? Because it makes sense, that if sacrifice comes first, then the symbol of exchange as money is going to come before the direct barter, trading of skills, right? That kind of makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know if I recall the specific facts on it, but I'm pretty
is there any evidence in history, like empirical evidence for that?
I'm pretty sure David Graeber talks about this in his 5,000 Years of Debt, right? Because if you make a mark that represents debt, that's basically based on, you're basically focusing on the exchange, the act of exchange, rather than the value of the good itself, right?
That's calculation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says that's a problem, right? Isn't he a communist, or he was, right? He was
something like that. I don't recall what else he specifically says. It's been a while since I read it. But essentially, the idea of keeping track of what what you're exchanging came before any sort of bartering. Like bartering was not the natural state.
Okay, interesting. He says that. David Graeber says that too, huh?
Don't quote me on that,
Okay.
but I feel like based on the evidence that he presents, it kind of implies that.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So let's flesh that out some more. Let's keep going with that.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so basically, this is why I like to focus on network economics and complexity theory and stuff like that, because I think that's really the direction you want to go in to really better understand the mimetic nature of value, right? You want to basically look at these like emergent properties of how humans interact with each other and how do they copy their desires. That's, to me, that's really the foundation of economics.
How they copy their desires.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we learn from that? Let's explain that. So the network economics, how do human beings copy desires in this network economic framework that you're alluding to?
Well, so the first thing you learn in economics 101 is scarcity, right? There's goods are scarce, therefore people desire them, and there's these demand curves and supply curves and stuff. So I would say that's the wrong way of looking at things. Your axiom you're starting with is wrong, like, because like something can be scarce, but if people don't care about it, they're not going to desire it, and there's no market for it. So you have to start before scarcity. You have to start with mimetic desire rather than just looking at scarcity.
Okay. Now, scarcity can inflame mimetic desire, but it doesn't necessarily inflame.
Yeah, absolutely. So scarcity, I would say scarcity is, economic scarcity is not the same thing as like intrinsic scarcity in the universe, and economic scarcity is a result of human mimetic behavior.
Right. Like masks are very in demand by some people for this virus thing, but that doesn't mean that, you know, they're scarce, but they are scarce for people who are looking for one and they really need one because they agree that this is a very important thing, right?
Yeah, so I would say that's basically what's been missing at the foundation of the field of economics. And we really can't, we almost want to, it's kind of like what you said before. We just need to recreate the field all over again, starting from the mimetic theory rather than from the
Can you try to sketch some of that out today? I want to do it. I want to hear some breakthrough insights. It doesn't have to be perfect or fully formed, but if you have anything you'd like to share, how to build that foundational economic framework back up, that'd be cool.
Let's see what I have.
Give us a taste for that. Give us a little sample of what you think.
I have a lot of these notes that I'm trying to look through, filter through. Hold up.
So your fundamental proposition that starts your rethinking of economics starts with, let's not start with scarcity, let's start with mimetic desire, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing is, like, for me, I have a lot of notes on tangential topics. I'm trying to figure out how to put it into like a concise narrative right now.
That's fine. Yeah.
Notes with one of my friends who's a lot more familiar with mimesis than I am. So he wrote some notes on mimesis and subjective value, and then also some notes on narrative economics. And
what is narrative economics?
So narrative economics is looking at narratives and try to basically figure out value from there. I guess that's not very specific. I think, so basically Robert Schiller wrote a paper on that, like, it was not too long ago, within the past 15, 20 years. And since then, I don't think it has been explored too much. And we're trying to figure out how that fits into how Girard talks about narratives. Because, you know, Girard's origin was not in religion. His origin was in analyzing these literary works.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's something that's been undervalued in the study
You need
of.
to create literary economics, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to go too far down that because you'll probably end up with some crazy postmodernism. but I think that is something that's overlooked in this, at least in the a lot of people who talk about Girard, I feel like they focus mostly on how to get rich from startups, or they focus on the religious aspects, but they don't really focus on where Girard began, which was in these literary works.
Right.
That's why I like to focus on Theater of Envy so much, because he outlined the mechanisms of desire just by having very simple examples found in these like love triangles.
So how do we use that as how do we sketch out some new insights into economics with that?
Action in the world, when you do any sort of like, when you interact with any type of market, you have to take action, and
Right.
your actions are affected by this by your mimetic model. So you have the subject, the object, and the model. Yeah. So anyway, you have your model, right? Like,
Let's say you're doing a TED Talks right now, and they've given you got 20 minutes to talk about the new theory of economics, and you don't have to get it all figured out, but you're just going to give someone a sketch. Let's go.
Yeah. So anyway, you mimic your desires from your surrounding, and when you mimic that desire from your neighbor, let's say your neighbor desires something, then you probably also desire it, and that's kind of like the foundation of the market. And as soon as you remove that neighbor, you'll also no longer desire that same object. But in the let's see if we can sketch out any demand or supply curves for that. So I think once you remove the neighbor, your demand for it actually decreases, right? So that means the supply. So I guess the price would also decrease because you decrease demand, which makes sense. So that confirms normal economics. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is I don't know how much like new insights or something that disproves modern economics would come out of this. I think it's more of like just like a different perspective of looking at things.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because it's very nuanced. When I talk about, for example, when I talked about the difference between greed and envy early on, for the average person, I don't know if they will be able to see much of a difference between those two.
What's the difference between greed and envy that you're seeing there?
So greed, I guess I would define more as something that's like a linear distribution where you always want more of this thing. While envy is more non-linear and also depends more on who else is also in the marketplace. Well, greed implies that even if nobody else is there desiring something, you still want to keep on desiring more and more of it, which is clearly not true, right? For example, if you have two people playing a game or trying to collect something in a game, they want to beat each other in the game. They want to collect the highest number of points. But if you're just by yourself, you don't care as much about being a high scorer.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting.
And
so
that's
you're challenging the left wing or liberal critique of capitalism being built on greed. You're saying no, it's envy that's mediating so much of what we're doing, right?
Yeah. Like if you think about it, nobody really cares about being a billionaire if like you're not copying the greed from other people. People want to be a billionaire because they see somebody else who has a high score and they just want to beat that other person's score.
Right. And if you bought the whole world but nobody could see it, you wouldn't care, right? You know?
Yeah.
Right. If you owned the whole planet but nobody was around to see you owning the whole planet, there would be no fun, right? So it is based on the eyes of another that you do what you do in the market, right?
Yeah. And you see all these people who say eat the rich, kill the rich. Like, notice that's pure envy. They're not saying I want to be richer. They're saying they want to kill the rich so that they can be above the rich. So they're in this mimetic rivalry with the
They
rich.
want to supplant them. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I would say mimetic theory applies more to perhaps the crazier stuff we've seen recently with GME and cryptocurrency than typical everyday economics, and also applies more to the economics of innovation. So I would say in terms of normal general economics, it probably will reach pretty much the same conclusions as the field of economics as we currently have, but in these specific fields of trading as well as in innovation startups, there's new meaning. And I guess that makes sense because people who are mostly interested in Girard nowadays are these innovators, like Peter Thiel, for example, and everyone else in the startup world is copying him because they see there's some big potential value there.
Right.
And so Girard talks about imitation, right? So if we want to look at imitation doesn't matter. Or I guess it does matter for everyone, but it matters more for people who want to be unique. They want to have a new, unique product. And so they want to basically break out of this perfect competition, like Thiel says. They want to stop being mimicked by their competitors in the same industry, and they want to stop mimicking them. So patents basically exists as a taboo against mimicry.
Right.
So I guess most people don't really think of patents as taboos. Like intellectual property, the whole point of intellectual property is it's essentially a type of religious taboo against imitation.
Well, all regulations are taboos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the reason why you can't sell food out of your house is because of food safety laws, because they want to prevent you from competing with Applebee's.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're afraid that your food that you cook at your house that you could sell directly to consumers to come pick up at a hot spot or a meetup spot or your house would create an undifferentiated marketplace for food services and eliminate the cartel of, restaurants that like to have, demand funneled into their direction. You see what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's a really great point. So like that's why laws, commandments, Sharia and stuff were so important in religions, because those were for regulating the mimetic desires.
Yeah, to create to keep a hierarchy in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's an interesting interaction going on in patents and innovation, because you basically want this IP production for a little bit, but not too much of it. Because when you have a little bit of it, you're preventing the mimicry at the beginning. Therefore, this new product can actually take off. But once it generates enough value for the creator, so that the creator deems it worth it to even bother with innovating in the first place, the patent laws goes away, and now like the rest of the world can share in the newly created value.
See, I see patents, particularly like in the field of medicine, as a sacrificial retardation of progress and innovation. You know what I mean? Because in terms of our knowledge, for example, the FDA, they require $1 billion in 10 to 15 years to get through their approval process, right?
Mm-hmm.
That automatically excludes health solutions that can't be patented, like diet, like vitamin D, like generic drugs. And so therefore that bias towards things that can be patented, it warps what research funding goes to in the development of understanding, double-blind studies on certain things to determine whether they are effective at treating or mitigating certain diseases, right? Because nobody wants to spend the $1 billion price tag and 10 to 15 years going through the FDA approval process to make a claim that vitamin D3 can do something to mitigate a disease, when everybody can use that research and that, approval because it's not something you can patent. You can't patent a natural thing like vitamin D. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of the problem, was the misalignment of incentives, and how like this current economy is focused too much on this fake differentiation that's not actually useful.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you have an example outside of medicine, like I just gave for medicine, that how patents are creating this fake differentiation that you just mentioned? Anything else comes to mind?
Yeah, definitely copyrights, right? Like copyrights are more ridiculous than patents. Like copyrights nowadays, they last like 70 years, maybe even up to 100 years. Like if you look at the history of copyrights, initially it was only like maybe 20, 30 years, and every few decades, the copyright laws change and the copyright gets extended. Like,
Do you think copyright law has retarded musical progress and musical quality?
Hold up. There's a study I'm thinking about. If I can look in my notes. I definitely in some sense.
Yeah.
But there's a particular study I'm thinking of though. So I would say yes in general, because when we copyright something for too long, especially like, let's say a character like Mickey Mouse. Disney is the biggest example of that. They copy every couple years, they lobby to increase the copyright laws so they can basically keep a copyright on their characters.
Yeah.
And this kind of prevents what we see in the old days when we have folk tales about all these different folk characters, because everyone now has to own their own unique character. Like the creator Harry Potter, she likes to sue people for creating fan fiction, and you no longer have this shared mythology. You just have specific people creating specific characters that they won't have the monopoly of, and they don't want anyone else to use without suing them.
That's interesting. I like that. So you're saying that the copyright and trademarks are preventing people from building a natural, organic, shared community, right? Of telling stories together.
Yep.
But you still have the fanfic community that's really popular online, right? You know, you got Star Wars fan fiction stories and all that. I mean, doesn't it still thrive in that environment?
Yeah, so people have a desire for it, but at the same time, you have all these like laws to try to suppress it and try to make it underground rather than like something that's more accepted.
Do you think it would be as popular without the taboo, though? Just like drug culture is popular because of the taboo? You know, would fan fiction culture be as popular and pervasive online if we didn't have that taboo of trying to kind of push it out as not real?
That's a good point.
You know what I mean? If everybody could draw Mickey Mouse and it was all considered Mickey Mouse, then what would be the draw of the taboo of, hey, look, this edgy community where we design our own Star Trek stories, you know, or whatever?
Yeah, so I guess I like to think about this type of stuff as like kind of analogous to the substitution income effect in economics, right? Like it's not obvious. Like you have one effect that can go in one direction, while another effect that can go in the opposite direction.
Right.
Something similar is going on here, where it just depends on the specific situation, which effect overpowers the other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that, and it reminds me of too of like, you know, the political stories we have where part of the country thinks one person is the scapegoat, the other one think, you know, like the Derek Chauvin, George Floyd thing. Half the country thinks George Floyd was the sacrificial lamb and Chauvin was the oppressor, and the other half thinks it's the opposite, that Chauvin was just doing his job and he's an innocent scapegoat of a raging political environment. And so there's two forces happening at the same time, right? In terms of there's a different arc to each story, but they kind of just swap the characters. Of course, this is because of Jesus that we have these fragmented stories, right? Because in the old days, when Oedipus Rex lost, there was no counter story about, no, actually Oedipus was a great guy. No. You know, history was written by the people who who banished Oedipus, and that's the final say on that, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's like you basically. Let me try to find this other good Girard quote in here.
Is that a theater of envy?
Yep. All right, so here's another interesting quote. When the dog and the god, the beast and the angel, and all such contraries oscillate fast enough, they become one, but not in the sense of some harmonious synthesis a la Hegel. Entities are beginning to merge that will never truly belong together. The result is a jumble of bits and pieces borrowed from the component beings. And let me go on to skip a couple lines to this other quote. Since there is no limit to the differences that can be jumbled together, the diversity of monsters will seem infinite, will seem to marry one another.
So yeah, so let's apply that back to the economic stuff you were working on. Anything that we can think of there?
Yeah, so
we're gonna call this a mimetic workshop on economics.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good discussion.
Okay. So here's something I'm still struggling to write about, which I'll probably write about eventually in my Substack, is that I think this current thing where everyone's so happy about pumping GME and destroying the hedge fund, it's actually going to be making things worse in the long term.
The GME is the GameStop stock, right?
Yeah. As well as like everyone's saying that crypto is like destroying the establishment and stuff.
Do you buy that? Do you buy that argument?
I don't think that's true. So like some of the dumb people like in the establishment who already have money, yeah, they'll probably lose out on it because they don't want to get in, or they don't want to, or they lost money on it. But the mechanism is not there. The mechanism is like this crypto pump and dump stuff. It's clearly like going to make some people. It's going to make the average person who get into the market poor, because the average person who gets into the market, they have no idea what's going on. They just so-called ape into whatever they think is the newest cool fad. So it's a complete mimetic contagion where they're just buying things without thinking about it. And when they get into these pump and dump schemes, a few people are going to make a lot of money selling at the top, but most people are just going to lose whatever they invested into there.
Isn't that what the dollar system is? It's a pump and dump scheme, isn't it?
What's that?
Isn't the dollar system a pump and dump scheme, kind of?
Yeah, pretty much. Like all of economics is kind of like that in a sense, but like definitely this like crypto amplifies it. So I don't want to say crypto is bad long term, but I think it has a lot of interesting potential and a lot of applications. But at the same time, I think it's a bit naive to think that finally you're going to arrive at some sort of utopia where everyone can be wealthy and live a life of abundance. I think a lot of people are going to be crying when the bear market comes.
What about the GME stock? Why is that going to make life worse for the average person?
I don't know if necessarily it'll make life worse for the average person, but I would actually say it makes it easier to create a hedge fund. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So, because the thing is like, now you know that there's this like new way of earning a lot of money quickly. Someone just start a fund on that. They don't need to be like a establishment hedge fund. You just start a new type of fund. Like no one's stopping you from doing that. And not only that, you can kind of capitalize so much easier on like the new people who get into the market, because now it's easier than ever to enter the marketplace. So there's going to be a lot more dumb people entering the market who are going to lose money to you. So if you're smart about it, you're just going to earn a lot more money that way.
So how do we prevent envy with business, with capital, with innovation, with startups? What are some ways that we can prevent or mitigate envy? Because that's really the biggest problem of our time. Envy creates hell for friendships. It creates hell for racial, interaction. It destroys wealth. It burns cities. It blows up countries. Envy is what's really the biggest problem of our time. It's what creates poverty, debt, the enslavement to debt. Everybody's got to get that bigger TV, and you got to get the bigger house that they can't afford. It's all envy. How can we, understanding economics through a mimetic framework, try to stave off and mitigate and contain envy?
Okay. So this is actually the point I meant to bring up earlier when I brought up Thiel, but I got off on a tangent on, which is, I think the point that everyone missed that he brought up is that his thesis is that economic growth is necessary because of mimetic theory. Because his idea is that economic growth is what keeps the violence at bay. If you have economic growth, you're not going to go to war and have uncontained violence.
Okay.
So basically, he says that the way to prevent large-scale, macro-scale global violence is to sustain economic growth, which I'm still trying to figure out if that's true or not, but I think it's an interesting proposal of his. So in a way, he almost doesn't want to contain the envy, but he wants to sublimate it. He wants to redirect it away from violence and more into consumption.
I think the miracle of the fishes and loaves illustrates that point. You know what I mean? Where you have the story of the kid who brings just a basket full of fish and loaves.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jesus takes it voluntarily. The child gives it, and he feeds the 5,000 with it. So he breaks scarcity, right? And he doesn't cut up the bread and fish into little tiny particles, so everybody gets a little bit. He breaks the concept of scarcity, so that just a little offering is the exchange, a little offering of love, of self-sacrifice. The child gives up their meal that was going to feed their family, and now that exchange, that voluntary exchange between the child and the teacher, provides food for everybody that breaks the foundations of scarcity, holding back, which is where envy comes from. Because if you cut up that fish, somebody's going to get left out. Theoretically, you could cut up the fish in loaves so that everybody gets a particle in a field of 5,000 people. But they're not going to be satisfied, and it may look like somebody got a little bit more than another.
Yeah.
And the moment somebody gets one atom of fish and loaf more than the other, you have envy and rivalry developing.
Yep.
And so Jesus breaks that whole matrix that we're all stuck on. And he says, no, I'm just going to keep pulling out and more fish and more loaves. And you're like, okay, is that just a magic trick? No, that's an attack on the concept of scarcity itself.
Yes.
It's a declaration of war against scarcity.
Yeah.
Such that when Jesus says later on, you will do greater things than I, that calls to mind those stories as prefigurements of what we are to do as his body on earth, right? Yeah. That we are to break that foundational matrix of scarcity through voluntary self-sacrifice. You create an abundance for people that alleviates the tension amongst the crowd, right?
Yeah. So I think that's also what Thiel meant when he said the problem with communism isn't redistribution but violence. Because if you just divide up the fish into like tiny pieces, you're doing a form of redistribution, but people are still going to fight over the food and there's still going to be violence. But if you multiply that food and give it to everyone else, you're still redistributing it, but you just have more of everything, but there's no violence. So I think his case is essentially, if you innovate, you can innovate out of that mimetic violence. If you create something that's truly of value and distribute it to people. And so I guess that's the ideal scenario for a innovation.
Right. And what I add on to that framework is he points to, we need to innovate in the world of atoms, right? And my argument is the reason why we have not innovated in the world of atoms is what I call the Jungle Book effect. And that was when the dropping of the nuclear bomb happened. It created a sacred, because like you were saying, mimetic violence is where sacred, aura develops, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that world destroying that supernatural almost event of seeing the nuclear bomb drop enshrined the physics framework at that time as untouchable. Mm-hmm. Because the thought was the priest who had come up with the equations that led to this bomb dropping, which could destroy the whole world, we are going to preserve those equations as sacred, not to be challenged, not to be questioned, because they have world-destroying consequences. And so that's my answer as to why the world of atoms has been so, one of the reasons why the world of atoms has lagged behind the world of bits is because of the nuclear bomb. That was this sacred event. The Jungle Book, Jungle Book, whoever masters fire rules the jungle. When society believed and the political class believed that the physics priests had mastered world-destroying fire in the bomb, it created a holy aura around the field that has, I think, held us back from questioning some of the assumptions that we've made about the atom, so that we're not able to experiment with things right under our noses that could help alleviate scarcity by creating energy too cheap to meter and so on and so forth. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that ties me back into the theater of envy again, in that it's when you fully mastered something, you no longer desire it. And that's what we see time and time again in Shakespeare. When the guy feels like he's completely has the girl, he loses interest in her, and then he moves on to another girl. So in this case, for society, the analogy is when people assume that they mastered the world of atoms, they move on to the digital world.
Right. Now, here's another way to push back on that, though. Some would say, but David, if you could, to challenge what we're saying and what Teal's saying, if you could provide everything for humans, they still would be caught up in drama and violence. Mm-hmm. Like if we had anti-gravity machines and we had, we could fly around the galaxies, and if we had cures for all the diseases that we're scared of subconsciously, and we could, have elemental transmutation at room temperature for rare earths and rare elements. And we could have all these abundant things, energy too cheap to meter with no carbon pollution or nothing. We would still be more pissed off at each other than ever. Do you believe that? A lot of people say that,
I think there's some truth in that. And I think that actually supports the mimetic perspective, right? Because you're still going to be comparing yourself to your neighbor. Like, I don't know. It's hard to imagine how, like, if it's going to be 100% true, but I think for sure there's still going to be a bunch of mimetic conflicts. It's not going to get
But that assumption is one of the biggest myths for why nobody does anything radical in physical innovation. You see what I mean? Because I think it's not only that we're afraid of challenging the physics establishment or whatever, chemical engineering, whatever it is that you want to do something grand in. It's also this feeling that what's the point? Humans are so wicked. If I do something like create anti-gravity, I'll be assassinated or arrested, or the media will attack me. And even if I got through all of that and the technology spreads around and everybody can go see grandma in 10 minutes across the world, and there's no pollution and there's no propulsion and, all these different things, it doesn't matter. Humans are so nasty, it's not even worth it. They'll just be worse off when I give them such a decadent, revolutionary technology. So what's the point? I think that is baked into our subconscious for why we don't do anything like that anymore. So that's what I'm wrestling with. Is it true, or is it not as true as we think it is? And if it is true, what is the incentive for us to still do those radical technology breakthroughs because of the persecution that inevitably comes for being the guy who does the great things like Galileo or Nikola Tesla or whatever? You see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess the counterpoint to that is like you see people innovate and create the vaccine, but then a lot of people still say you're still gonna have to wear the masks even if you took the vaccine. so like the problem doesn't. So it kind of validates the problem doesn't go away even if you do create the innovation.
So then why innovate? Is the act of innovation itself the glory? Is that the glory in and of itself without having a necessity or something, like you were saying earlier?
Yeah.
Is that what the divine, is that the divine moment of innovation and creativity, is doing it in and of itself without trying to say, well, this will stop violence by 20%, or this will cure the planet by 30% pollution? You know what I mean? Once you stop worrying about calculation, you just start doing something beautiful and unique in and of itself. That is the thing to do, right?
Well, I think innovation has to do more with personal incentives than trying to like look at the whole world and trying to decrease a particular metric like violence, right? It's more like you want to outcompete your competitors. You want to get out of the same paradigm as your competitors, so you try to do something different.
Right.
So, but it's not necessarily for the end goal of decreasing violence. At least for the average person, that's not what they're consciously thinking about.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it's more like this mechanism that exists, and there's all sorts of emergent properties about it, but it's not necessarily that every part of this whole economic mechanism with every single person, they're particularly focused on the end goal of ending violence or ending mimetic competition.
Speaking of mimetic competition, and it's a little bit out of economic field, but not really.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about, China in relationship to America. Because America has the infection of victim concern because of Judeo-Christian and heritage that we've been more steeped in longer.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, excuse me, is it a death knell to have an infection of the gospel technology in your society comparative to other cultures that are not as infected with the gospel technology and its concern for victims? Does that make sense what I'm saying? It seems like America right now is fracturing over every little issue. Every little thing is so sensitive. Cereal, everything feels like it's all schism, 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 schism. We're so obsessed with hating and trying to quarantine shame onto rivals within our community because we're haunted by the exposure of the scapegoat mechanism for so many years in our Western tradition. That how can it be good news that one society has this and another society doesn't have that infection as deep and it's able to stay unified and focused on excellence and merit and so forth?
Yeah.
Basically, is the human species able to handle the nuclear power of the gospel technology without blowing itself up into oblivion? Or are we too short-sighted for looking at the comparative advantage of China right now in relationship to America? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the question makes sense, but I guess I would probably rather use the example of Islam rather than China. So what I noticed recently, I've been talking to a lot of Muslims, and what they say is like they see how the Quran and their beliefs and their practices are completely misrepresented in the West, but they don't really buy into the victim mentality stuff because originally it's like a warrior culture type of religion where they're not afraid to say, like, when people say Muhammad is a warlord, like in a very derogatory way in the West, they say, okay, so what? Muhammad defeated his enemies. Jesus did not defeat his enemies. So if you want to compete in a capitalist world, you want to defeat your enemies. And it just shows that he's successful in every aspect of life.
So what do you think of that?
I thought it was a very interesting perspective. And one thing I've been trying to, which I don't have the answer for, that I'm still trying to figure out, is that if you look at the history of the Silk Road, every single religion was on the Silk Road, traveling from Eastern Europe to China. But the end result is that Islam became the predominant religion of the Silk Road for some reason.
Why do you think that is?
I don't have the exact answer right now, but that's why I'm so interested in looking more into it. Because like to me, as a immigrant, like I immigrated to America when I was 7 years old with my parents. And if you think about it, Islam is basically the religion of immigrants. Like everyone is traveling along the Silk Road, experiencing all these different cultures, but everyone's, for some reason, people chose Islam over Christianity and Buddhism, which were also very prevalent on the Silk Road. Somehow it made them more successful. So perhaps when you have to deal with intercultural conflicts, there's some sort of mechanism in Islam that I don't know what it is yet, that made it easier to deal with that type of stuff.
Interesting. So you don't, you just, that's interesting to think about. Well, hey, I want to give you a chance to give a plug to your work, and we have your Substack here, mimetic.substack.com, for people to check out more of your blog posts. Where else would you like to point people towards your work?
Well, my old Twitter, Mimetic Value, is now dead. So I guess I'll point you to my new one, which is Shestovian. So Shestov, which is the philosopher I like a lot, and then just IAN after it on Twitter.
Very good. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you. And we should keep in touch.
Very good. Take care.